Welcome, dear listeners. Imagine this. You find a helpless animal in need. Take it in, care for it, and form an unbreakable bond. But what if, one day, you realize it's not what you thought it was? Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth. And don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. Chapter 1. A Stormy Night's Discovery. Ethan Reed tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his truck rumbled down the dark, rain-slicked road. It had been a brutal 48-hour shift at the fire station, and exhaustion settled deep in his bones. All he wanted was a hot shower and the kind of sleep that wiped everything away. The wipers thrashed against the windshield, barely keeping up with the relentless rain. Outside, the world was a blur of shadow and water, the empty highway stretching endlessly before him. Almost home, Ethan muttered to himself, shifting in his seat to stay awake. He knew this road well. It was the final stretch before the turnoff to his quiet little cabin on the outskirts of town. He normally enjoyed the peacefulness of the drive, but tonight, the storm made everything feel eerie. Then he saw it, a dark, hunched shape on the side of the road, barely illuminated by his headlights. His first thought was that it was just a piece of debris, maybe a fallen branch from the storm. But then, it moved. Ethan squinted, his firefighter's instincts kicking in. The figure was small, trembling, his heart clenched. He knew he should just keep driving. He was exhausted, and stopping in this weather was a risk. But something in his gut told him otherwise. With a sigh, he flipped on his hazard lights and pulled onto the shoulder. The rain hammered against the roof as he reached for his flashlight, its cold metal familiar in his hand. As soon as he stepped out of the truck, the freezing rain soaked through his jacket. The wind howled through the trees, making it hard to hear anything else. He walked toward the small figure, shining his light ahead. The beam illuminated a tiny, drenched animal curled up near the guardrail. Ethan's breath caught. It was a puppy, or at least, it looked like one. Its fur was matted with mud, its frail body shivering uncontrollably. It was so small and thin that it barely looked alive. Ethan crouched, keeping his voice low and soothing. "Hey there, buddy, it's okay," he murmured. The tiny creature lifted its head slightly, dark, glossy eyes peering up at him. But something about those eyes made Ethan pause. They were too large, too intelligent. The puppy let out a sound, a weak, high-pitched chirp. Ethan frowned. That was no bark or whimper. It was something else entirely. But there was no time to think about it. The poor thing was freezing to death. Gently, he shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around the puppy, lifting it into his arms. It barely reacted, just pressed its small body against his chest, shivering violently. As he carried it back to the truck, he could feel its heartbeat, fast, frantic, but still there. That was a good sign. Once inside, Ethan turned the heater on full blast, holding the puppy close as he rubbed its fur dry with his sleeve. The little thing made that odd chirping noise again but didn't struggle. It was probably too weak to fight. "You're safe now," Ethan murmured, glancing down at the fragile creature in his lap. "I got you." He drove the rest of the way home with one hand on the wheel, the other cradling the trembling puppy against his chest. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the storm had settled into a steady drizzle, mist rolling over the ground. Ethan carried the puppy inside, straight to his bathroom, where he grabbed a warm towel and gently dried it off. Under all the wet, matted fur, he could feel how skinny and delicate the little thing was. It barely opened its eyes but let out another soft chirp. Ethan chuckled tiredly. "You're a weird one, huh?" He grabbed an old blanket and folded it near the heater, making a soft nest for the pup. The moment he placed it down, the tiny creature curled into a tight ball, its oddly large ears twitching slightly. Ethan sat on the couch, staring at it for a long moment. Where had it come from? Had someone dumped it in the storm? Was there a worried owner somewhere, searching for their lost pet? He'd check for missing pet notices tomorrow. For now, he just needed sleep. His eyelids grew heavy, and exhaustion finally dragged him under. But just as sleep took him, he heard it again, that soft, strange chirping sound, and in the dim glow of the heater, the tiny creature lay awake, its dark eyes watching him closely. Chapter 2. The First Signs. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the wooden floor. Ethan stirred, his muscles aching from the long shift at the firehouse. For a moment, He forgot about the strange little creature he had rescued the night before. But then, a chirping sound. His eyes snapped open. He turned his head toward the makeshift nest by the heater. The tiny pup, if it even was a pup, was awake and moving. But instead of the sluggish, weak creature from last night, it was alert, its dark eyes locked onto him. Unblinking, Ethan pushed himself up, stretching out his sore shoulders before kneeling down beside the little thing. "Morning, buddy." The puppy twitched its large ears, its pink nose wiggling as it sniffed the air. Ethan reached over, grabbing a small bowl of water from the kitchen and setting it down near the blanket. The pup hesitated, sniffed, and then ignored it. Frowning, Ethan stood up and rummaged through his fridge. He tore off a small piece of turkey and held it out. "Come on, you have to eat something." Again, the tiny creature sniffed at the food but didn't eat it. Instead, it did something odd. It grabbed the turkey in its tiny jaws and, instead of chewing, it trotted to the corner of the room and tried to bury it under the rug. Ethan blinked. Well, that's different. Most puppies ate as soon as food was in front of them. This one? It was hoarding it. Ethan sighed and sat back down on the couch. The pup wandered around the room cautiously, its thin legs moving with an eerie sort of grace, not the clumsy, wobbly steps he'd seen in most young dogs. He watched as it explored, its tiny paws silent on the wooden floor. Then it spotted a pen cap that had rolled under the table. In an instant, it pounced on it, quick, precise, almost predatory. Ethan exhaled. "All right, you're weird." The pup responded with another chirp, its head tilting in that peculiar way. Something about that sound made Ethan uneasy. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even close. Shaking off the thought, he stood and grabbed his phone. Scrolling through search results, he typed in, "Caring for an abandoned puppy. Why won't my puppy eat?" Strange puppy noises. The articles that popped up were normal enough, but none of them described the odd chirping sound his new companion made. Ethan glanced at the pup again. It had stopped moving, its large eyes studying him, as if it knew exactly what he was doing. His stomach twisted with something he couldn't name. Trying to shake off the unease, he focused on the basics. First things first, a vet visit. By the time Ethan pulled into the small veterinary clinic, the morning sun had risen fully, casting light over the damp streets. The rain from last night had left behind a lingering chill in the air. Rustling noises came from the small crate on the passenger seat as his unusual companion shifted inside. Clearly restless, Dr. Patel, a middle-aged vet with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, greeted him as he stepped inside. "Morning, Ethan. What do we have here?" Ethan set the crate on the table, carefully unzipping it. The small creature inside hesitated, its large ears flicking at the unfamiliar sounds of the clinic. The vet reached inside, lifting the pup gently. Immediately, her brow furrowed. "Well," she said slowly, examining it, "this is interesting." Ethan tensed. "Interesting how?" Dr. Patel ran her hands along the pup's thin but sturdy frame, checking its teeth, ears, and paws. "These teeth are sharp, more developed than a normal puppy's would be at this stage." She carefully examined its legs, its claws, longer than expected, and its movements, she continued, watching as the little creature twisted away from her hands with surprising agility, landing silently on the examination table. Ethan crossed his arms. "So, what do you think?" Dr. Patel exhaled, tapping her fingers against her clipboard. "I don't want to jump to conclusions." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Jump to what, exactly?" She hesitated before saying carefully, "I think you should consider a DNA test. Just to be sure." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "It's just a stray puppy." Dr. Patel gave him a pointed look. "Ethan, are you sure?" The pup let out another soft chirp, its dark eyes flicking between the two humans. Dr. Patel frowned. "I've never heard a dog make a sound like that." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had been telling himself the same thing all morning. Dr. Patel took a slow breath. "Look, it could be a genetic anomaly. Maybe a rare mix. But if you want to be absolutely sure." Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Fine, let's do the test." She nodded, taking a small swab sample from inside the pup's mouth before placing it in a sealed bag. "It'll take about a week for the results." Ethan glanced down at the pup, who was now perched on the table, its ears twitching attentively. "A week," Something told him he wouldn't have to wait that long to realize the truth. That night, as Ethan sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone, he couldn't stop noticing things. The way the pup moved, silent, quick, calculating. The way its large ears picked up sounds no human could hear. The way it watched him, like it was trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand it. And worst of all, that soft, bird-like chirp in the dark. A sound that had no business coming from a dog. Chapter 3. Signs of something wild. Ethan woke to the sound of soft scratching. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling near the floor. He blinked against the dim morning light, sitting up slowly. The blanket he had thrown over himself during the night was tangled, half on the floor, his body stiff from falling asleep on the couch again. He turned his head toward the heater. The tiny creature he had rescued was awake, moving quietly, deliberately around the room. Unlike normal puppies that stretched and yawned clumsily after sleep, this one's movements were fluid and precise, like it had been awake for hours. Observing, rust-colored fur caught the weak morning sunlight, highlighting the subtle changes in its coat. What was once damp and matted now looked sleek, soft, and slightly thicker than before. Ethan rubbed his face, trying to push away the grogginess. "Morning, little guy," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. The pup froze for a second, then tilted its head toward him, those dark, intelligent eyes locking onto his. For the first time, Ethan noticed something strange about the way it looked at him. It wasn't the eager, tail-wagging excitement of a normal puppy greeting its human. It was measured, calculated. The little creature studied him. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You are one weird dog." The pup twitched its oversized ears, let out a short chirp, then trotted away toward the kitchen. That noise, it had been bothering him for days now. It wasn't a bark, not a whimper, not even a growl. It was almost bird-like. Ethan stood up, stretching his stiff back before following the pup into the kitchen. It had already found its way under the table, sniffing at the corner where it had hidden the turkey from yesterday. He crouched down, watching as the little thing dug at the floor as if trying to bury something that wasn't even there. "You're hoarding food. That's new." The pup twitched an ear at his voice but kept at it, its small body moving with an unsettling level of coordination for something so young. Ethan sighed and walked over to the fridge, pulling out a small bowl of eggs he had scrambled earlier. He set it down in front of the pup, watching carefully. It sniffed the food, then did something even stranger. Instead of eating, it took tiny mouthfuls and carried them away, searching for places to hide them, behind the trash can, under the cabinets, even in the corner of the couch. Ethan frowned. All right, that's definitely not normal. He had raised dogs before. Puppies devoured food when they were hungry. This one was saving it for later. Something cold curled in Ethan's stomach. He knew this behavior. He had seen it before, but not in dogs. Foxes. A ridiculous thought, but once it took root in his mind, it wouldn't let go. He crossed his arms, watching the pup move, the long legs, the narrow face, the high-pitched vocalizations, the hoarding instinct, the unsettling way it never wagged its tail like a normal dog. Ethan let out a slow breath. "You're not a dog, are you?" The creature paused mid-step, as if it understood him. Then, without warning, it leapt onto the couch with startling grace. Not the clumsy hop of a young pup, but the effortless, weightless movement of something built for speed. Ethan's heart kicked up a notch. Dogs didn't move like that. His phone buzzed on the counter, making him jump. He shook his head, muttering to himself as he walked over to grab it. A text from Dr. Patel. "DNA results should be in by tomorrow. Call me when you have a minute." Ethan stared at the screen, then turned his gaze back to the creature perched on his couch. Tail curled around itself like a cat. Tomorrow. But deep down, he already knew. That night, as Ethan sat at his desk, he found himself searching things he never thought he would. Can foxes be domesticated? Fox behavior compared to dogs. Keeping a wild animal as a pet. The more he read, the more uneasy he became. Foxes were intelligent, solitary, and highly alert. They made a series of vocalizations, none of which sounded like traditional dog barks. They hoarded food, preferred to sleep hidden, and were notoriously difficult to train. Ethan glanced over at the little creature curled up at the edge of the couch. He needed proof. Pulling out his phone, He recorded a short video. "Alright, let's see what you really are." He tossed a small ball across the room. The pup didn't chase it. Instead, it watched the movement with unsettling focus, waiting for it to settle before creeping toward it like a predator. Another test. Ethan grabbed a squeaky toy and squeezed it. No reaction. Then, he whistled softly. Instantly, the little creature snapped to attention, ears swiveling toward him, eyes locked onto his face. Not in excitement, in pure instinctual awareness. Ethan felt his pulse throb in his throat. That wasn't how a puppy reacted. That was how a wild animal locked onto prey. His hands trembled slightly as he stopped the recording. He stared at his screen, watching the footage back. His puppy was not a puppy. The realization settled heavily over him, a mix of awe and fear. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Tomorrow, Dr. Patel would confirm it. But he already knew the truth. And the real question wasn't what Rusty was anymore. It was what he was going to do about it. Chapter 4. The truth comes out. The morning was crisp and clear. The storm from days before now just a memory. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Staring at his phone, the message from Dr. Patel blinked at him like a warning. "DNA results are in. Call me when you're ready." He wasn't ready. He glanced toward the living room where Rusty lay curled up in a tight ball, tail wrapped around himself, his small body rising and falling with each breath. In the morning light, his fur looked richer, more vibrant. He had grown so much in just a few days. His frame leaner, his features sharper. Ethan had seen puppies grow before, but never like this. He exhaled and finally pressed the call button. Dr. Patel picked up on the second ring. "Ethan, thanks for calling. I have your results. Just tell me," he said, gripping the coffee mug tighter. There was a pause on the other end, like she was choosing her words carefully. "Rusty is 100% Vulpes. A red fox. Not a hybrid, not a domestic breed. A pure, wild fox." Ethan felt his stomach drop, even though he'd already known the truth. Hearing it confirmed out loud still sent a jolt through him. "That's what I thought," he muttered. "Ethan," she said gently, "I know you've bonded with him, but keeping a fox as a pet is illegal in this state. Wildlife officials are strict about these cases. If they find out, they'll take him." He finished for her, his voice tight. "Yes," she said softly, "and once they do, there's no telling what will happen to him. Wild sanctuaries are overcrowded. If he's deemed too domesticated to survive in the wild but too wild to be adopted, the outcome isn't always good." Ethan's jaw clenched. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you plan to keep him, you need to be very careful. If anyone reports you, you won't have a choice." Ethan let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. "What if I apply for an exotic animal permit?" "It's possible, but rare. The process is complicated, and approvals are hard to get. You'd need evidence that Rusty can't survive in the wild." Ethan's chest tightened. Rusty had imprinted on him. He didn't act like a wild animal. He had never even attempted to leave. But that wouldn't matter to authorities. "Thanks, Doc," he said, hanging up. He placed his phone on the table and looked at Rusty, who had woken up and was watching him. Those sharp amber-brown eyes locked onto him with unnerving focus. "What am I gonna do with you?" "Huh?" Ethan muttered. Rusty just chirped softly, tilting his head in that way that made him look far too intelligent. Ethan knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting anyone take him. The next few days, Ethan made adjustments. He stopped taking Rusty outside in daylight. He canceled plans with friends, not wanting anyone to come over and ask questions. He even installed a higher fence in his backyard, just in case. But Rusty could feel the change. He paced the house restlessly, pressing his nose against the windows, his ears swiveling at every outdoor sound. His energy levels had skyrocketed, and Ethan struggled to keep up. One night, Ethan sat on the couch, watching as Rusty darted from one side of the living room to the other. His movements quick, deliberate, controlled. He wasn't playing, he was practicing. He was growing into what he was meant to be. And Ethan couldn't stop it. That night, he barely slept, his mind racing. If he kept Rusty, he'd always have to look over his shoulder. If someone found out, he'd lose him. But if he released him, would he survive? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden scratching sound. He shot up, heart pounding, scanning the dark room. Rusty was at the back door. his nose pressed against the small crack where fresh air seeped in. His body was tense, ears alert, tail stiff. Ethan frowned, moving slowly toward him. "What is it, boy?" Then he heard it. A noise from outside. Not a human, not a dog. Another chirp, higher, distant. Rusty stilled completely, then let out a series of chirps in response. Ethan's stomach twisted. Something was calling to him. And worse? He was answering. For the first time, Ethan realized that no matter how much Rusty had bonded with him, no matter how many nights he spent curled up on the couch like a pet, there was something primal inside him that could never be tamed. Ethan clenched his fists. Rusty was still just a baby. He needed protection. He needed a home. But was keeping him really the right thing to do? The answer felt further away than ever. That night, as Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he knew one thing. Rusty had a choice to make. And soon, Ethan would have to make one too. If you were Ethan, would you let Rusty go or fight to keep him? Stay tuned for the final chapter to see what he decides. Chapter 5. The Hardest Decision. Ethan sat on the porch steps, staring out at the tree line beyond his backyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden streaks across the yard. Behind him, Rusty paced restlessly, his lean body moving with a grace that no puppy should have. His ears flicked toward every tiny sound, his nose twitching as he caught scents that Ethan couldn't even begin to detect. For days now, Ethan had been avoiding the truth. He had tried to keep Rusty inside, away from prying eyes. He had done everything to convince himself that this was just a phase, that Rusty would settle, that he could be something he wasn't meant to be. But the night Rusty had chirped back at something in the woods, Ethan had realized something undeniable. Rusty was waiting. Waiting for something out there. Or maybe just waiting for Ethan to understand. A sudden movement snapped Ethan from his thoughts. Rusty had stopped pacing. His body had gone completely still. His ears pointed toward the tree line. Then came the sound again. A call from the forest. A high, distant chirp, barely audible, but unmistakable. Ethan felt his breath catch. Rusty's head turned sharply toward him. His amber eyes filled with something new. Not just longing, understanding. Ethan swallowed hard. "You hear them, don't you?" Rusty chirped in response, his tail flicking slightly. He stepped toward the door, hesitated, then stepped back toward Ethan. His movements were uncertain, like he was caught between two different worlds, one he had known and one he had yet to explore. Ethan clenched his fists. Every instinct in him screamed to keep Rusty safe, to lock the doors, to ignore the calls, to convince himself that Rusty belonged here, with him. But that wasn't the truth. Rusty had never belonged here. Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest tight. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go see." Rusty didn't move at first, just watched him carefully. Then, as if sensing the finality in Ethan's voice, he trotted after him as Ethan walked down the steps toward the edge of the property. The forest was darker than usual, the trees casting long shadows. Ethan's boots crunched softly against the undergrowth as he led Rusty past the fence line for the first time. The fox moved silently beside him, his body low, his senses sharp. Then, just ahead, a flicker of movement. Ethan stopped. Rusty did too. Two figures stood just beyond the clearing. Foxes. Real foxes. Their fur rich and untamed. Their eyes gleaming in the dim light. They were watching. Rusty's entire body tensed. Ethan could feel the energy vibrating through him. The moment had come. He knew Rusty had to go. But still, his heart fought against it. He knelt down beside him, resting a hand on his back. "You can go, buddy," he whispered. "It's okay." Rusty turned to face him, his ears twitching. His amber eyes searched Ethan's face, as if trying to understand what this meant. Ethan forced a small smile. "Even though it hurt, you were never meant to stay." Rusty let out one final, soft chirp. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. Another. Then he ran. His lean body moved like liquid through the undergrowth, his paws silent against the earth. The two wild foxes turned and vanished into the trees. And Rusty followed. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, listening. But the woods were silent again. Rusty was gone. The walk back to the house felt longer than before. The porch light cast a warm glow over the doorway. But the house already felt emptier. For the first time in weeks, Ethan was truly alone. He stepped inside, rubbing his face, trying to shake the hollow feeling in his chest. He had done the right thing. The only thing. But that didn't make it easier. That night, he sat on the couch, half expecting to hear that familiar chirp from the corner of the room. But there was only silence. The next few days passed slowly. Ethan forced himself to fall back into routine, work, chores, anything to keep his mind busy. But every time he glanced at the empty blanket by the heater, or the small spaces where Rusty used to hide his food, a pang of loss hit him. Then, one evening, as he stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, he heard it, a chirp. His heart jumped. He turned his head toward the woods, searching. Then, from the shadows, a pair of glowing amber eyes watched him. Ethan exhaled, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Rusty had come back, not to stay, not to be tamed, but just to let him know he hadn't forgotten. And that was enough. If you enjoyed Rusty's journey, what would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you have let him go? Let us know in the comments.